I'm Pierre Corbin, and I'm the director of The Great Reset and the Rise of Bitcoin. And what I do is I just try and make, research about, yes, thank you. Thanks a lot. Around Bitcoin, and then just try to make films out of it and spread more education just in a way that has been maybe easier for people to understand. At least I hope so, and that's the feedback that I get. If you haven't watched it, I recommend watching it. This one is really about the state of our economy, where we're at, explaining inflation properly, and then just presenting Bitcoin as an alternative and a potential solution to all the problems that we're facing. So the kind of, typical Bitcoin story, just in a nice made, professional-looking documentary. But today, we're here, one sec, I'm not sure what button I should press. All right, we're here to talk about Bitcoin in Central America. And it's an important topic for Bitcoin because that's where the adoption of Bitcoin is happening at an accelerated rate, right? There's El Salvador that adopted Bitcoin there. And I'm going to tell you a few stories of how this is happening over there. And now, exactly El Salvador. Now, part of the research that I'm doing is for a new project that I call the Fight for the US Dollar, where I really want to look at who's trying to block Bitcoin adoption around the world and what kind of influences they're using in order to make that happen. And what I'm going to talk about right now is rather the opportunity that Bitcoin is for a place like Central America. But it goes beyond Central America, actually. It's not just a Central American thing. It's actually more of a story. You can imagine it when it comes to any nation, third world country that has been a victim of the colonial era. And it goes back to, you can think of the European nations of the 14th and 15th century and how they decide to spread around the world. And I think a good story that represents all of this and how these influences are used today too is the one of France in Central Africa. So after the Second World War and the Bretton Woods Agreement, the IMF was created, and France had to, the UN was also created, and France had to give the independence to these nations. But they, made sure that they would keep certain control on Central Africa. And they created the franc CFA, which in French means Franc des Colonies Françaises d'Afrique, which is the franc of French colonies of Africa. Now, what's interesting about it is that these are the countries. It's 14 countries. It's divided into two parts. There's like the Western Central Africa part and the South Africa part, South Central African part. And that's two separate central banks, but they all answer to one central bank that is in Paris, in France, right? So that's 14 countries and about 200 million people. And France is the country that takes their monetary decisions and more. Actually, it goes into their entire economy and the decisions that they make. For example, if Congo, for example, that is one of these countries from the southern region, decides to export a new product like coffee, then they first need to offer this to France. And only once France rejects it because they don't need it, do they have the right to sell it internationally, right? So for example, in the case of Congo trying to sell coffee, let's say they sell it to China, then China pays them, but they don't pay them directly, they have to pay France. So the transaction goes to the central bank that is managed in Paris. And then they do two transactions. First, they change the yuan into euro, and after that, the euro into the franc CFA. And along the way, they take transaction fees, commissions, and so on. Right? So it just shows you the kind of way these international influences are still used today and are made to make sure that these nations that were once colonial states remain independent, but under the control of these nations. And this is all in the name of keeping the region secure, right? Because of course, the moment that France let them go, then there was no chance that these countries were able to manage themselves. And what's interesting is that the IMF basically has been supporting this message since its inception. Now, there's a lot of things in play there when it comes to these international institutions. But something interesting to point out is that these are the 12 IMF managing directors since the inception of the IMF. And 5 of them were French, right? So just keeping this message and this status for these countries is made easier thanks to this. But if we're talking about international institutions, another interesting one is the United Nations that was created in 1945. And this really was pushed by the US because they're the ones that benefited from this creation the most. And the reason is because in 1823, the US started this Monroe Doctrine that maybe some of you have heard about, which is how the US started to take control over the Western Hemisphere. And what they did, it was just a play on power. So no one wanted to mess with the US because they just had gained their independence and they showed that they were strong nations. And they essentially told the world, and mostly the European nations that were messing in the region, they told them, look, this is our area. We're going to be here to defend the freedom of this entire hemisphere. And they did this through the Monroe Doctrine. And what did this look like for Central America? Well, these are early numbers, and the dollar was worth a lot less than it is, a lot more than it is now. So from 1897 to 1908, which is a decade, the investments there went from 21 million to 41 million, right? Which means that it essentially doubled. And numbers for these countries separately are kind of crazy, and they show how the US basically took over. And I have just a short clip from a video I made about this topic that I just want to play here that will give some of these numbers. Video cannot be loaded. You guys can just go check this out on the YouTube channel, The Great Reset Films. That's one of the last videos I made, and it describes pretty much what I'm talking about now, but there's a lot more details because there's a lot of data that I just didn't learn by heart for this presentation. But the important part is that this led to the creation of these banana republics. I'm pretty sure that everyone heard the term. Sure, there's a brand called Banana Republic, but I mean the actual source of that term. And this basically is the fact that there's nations in Central America that focused on one or two industries maximum. And banana is the best example. This is where the name comes from. And so what they did is that they were only producing bananas and selling this all only to the United States. So the US basically took over these industries, and as soon as they no longer needed this, then there was no buyer for their unique industry, and it led to a lot of economic problems for the region. And it happened, of course, multiple times, because if you think about it, in the last century, which is when the US was mostly influential there, pushing aggressively their influence, there were two world wars. And during that time, while the US did not need bananas, they needed weapons. And so they stopped importing all of these products. And so what happened after that is that they were broke and they were reaching out to the US, calling for help. And what did the US do? They helped by giving them loans, credit, further making them dependent on the US, because not only were they their only customer, but now they owed them a lot of money. And this led to, a lot of, increased influence in the US and just corruption in the region. So essentially, the US took control of the region, but not really by using military force, although this came a lot as well. But they did it really through the corporate acquisition of full nations, because they owned everything. They owned all the railways. They owned most of the industries and so on. And this led, of course, to the push of the US dollar in the region. So a lot of the countries adopted the US dollar either just as a secondary currency, and some of them, for example, El Salvador, even adopted the US dollar as their legal tender. Right? They did this in 2001. But then things kind of started changing. Now, I think a lot of us know this chart, which is the M2 money stock, and how much dollar was created from 2020, right, in order to fight the war against COVID. And this is when El Salvador came out deciding to adopt Bitcoin. And this is one of the reasons why they did it. Because for a country that uses the US dollar but cannot control it, then they're only going to suffer from the decisions that are taken in the US. And in that case is that so much money was printed because the economy was stopped and they wanted to stimulate the economy. El Salvador got nothing out of this. The only thing that they're getting out of it for sure is that they're going to have huge inflation. So that was one of the decisions, right? There's the inflation of the US dollar, there's remittances that are coming from abroad, banking the unbanked, increase tourism, and just attract foreign investment. And I just want to cover how it went for them so far since this adventure started for them. So when it comes to remittances, right, this is the fact that, in El Salvador, there's 6 million people living, and 2 million Salvadorans live abroad, in the US mostly, and they send money home, right? And you can see, so September 2021, that's the month when they adopted Bitcoin. There was $2.6 million that were sent back in Bitcoin. And it quickly increased until now, it's stable at around $10 million per month, which is very little. Don't get me wrong. There's around $600 million on average that are sent to El Salvador in remittances. So if we're talking about 10 million, it's very little, right? What's important here is the opportunity that it represents. Because to do this, you can use the Lightning Network, in which case it's instant and free, and it increases the security of people that are sending this money back. Banking the unbanked. So in El Salvador, there's about 35% of the population that has a bank account, which is, very little. You can compare this to Bulgaria. That's 84% in Bulgaria. In the US, 95%. Germany and France, we're at 99% of the people that have a bank account. And in El Salvador, it means that there's 65% of the population that is completely eliminated from this financial system. And it means that they can't transact online if they would want to, right? And one of the reasons is, and the main reason for that is actually discrimination against the poor. They earn so little that it's not worth it for them to have bank accounts, so the banks won't let them open them, right? And with the adoption of Bitcoin, the Chivo wallet, which is the one that was given to the public by the by the Salvadoran government, instantly they got 4 million users, right? Now, how much is used, that's a different topic, but it opens up the world of spending online and even spending locally to everyone there, right? An opportunity that they never had before. Tourism has increased 30% since the Bitcoin law. A lot of it, I think, is because there's Bitcoiners like me that decided to go spend a full month there, right? And so you go and spend your money. But at the same time, it's a great place. I recommend everyone to travel there. And it led to a lot of other positives for the country, like they have an increase of 10% in GDP, which is, for their modern history, the first time that they have such a big increase, right? And then another important one that relates very much to Bitcoin as well is the fact that they've increased their energy output by 190%. This is huge in a bit over a year, right? And one of the reasons why they did that is because they want to accommodate for miners that would come from abroad, but also they themselves are mining Bitcoin, right? And we know that having an abundance of energy is a great way to develop society, right? That's literally one of the reasons why we've developed so much as a species in the last century, right? Because we just found very good sources of easy energy. And the same is true for El Salvador. And on top of that, they've more than doubled as well their exports of energy. So an entirely new industry has been created in El Salvador that allows to increase their GDP the way they have. Now, this adoption is kind of going slow. I spent 1 month there. This is a picture from when I was arriving there, just before landing. And a lot of people are not actually using Bitcoin. If you spend some time at Bitcoin Beach, then sure, this is Hope House in the background behind that was my first steps in Bitcoin Beach, actually. If you go out of Bitcoin Beach where you can spend, you can pay for your hotel in Bitcoin, you can pay for your dinner, whatever you want in Bitcoin. You go out of there, it's much harder. There's a lot of places that will not accept Bitcoin. You have to pay in dollar. But this is changing, right? It's slowly evolving. In fact, it's a slow adoption, but it's a positive thing. This is basically how we want it, because the only thing that El Salvador did is just create a space where this currency can develop from the ground up, right? Which is the choice of people. And it's a big experiment for Bitcoin, and it's important for it to succeed there. But the way the media presents it, that it is a failure because the adoption is so slow, is a complete misunderstanding of how money can be adopted. We're just used to having a government telling us, use this money, and everyone automatically does it, right? Otherwise, you lose all of your funds. In this case, everyone just has to choose to be part of that system. So it's very, very powerful. And so, it started all in El Salvador, but it goes beyond that now, right? In the region alone, there's Honduras, there's, Bitcoin Valley. There's also the free economic zone of Prospera that just wants to attract people. In the case of Bitcoin Valley, it's tourism. In the case of Prospera, it's investment and companies to set up over there. But there's also, in Guatemala, Bitcoin Lake that has been inspired by what was happening in Bitcoin Beach. So these are just like the beginnings of what happened in El Salvador, too. But we can go beyond that, right? Even if you go a bit more south. In Brazil, just a few days ago, I think it was announced that there's 12,000 businesses that hold Bitcoin. So the adoption is spreading, right? We can go even further than that, And here, there's Madeira, this independent island, but that is part of Portugal. There's the Central African Republic that made a Bitcoin legal tender, and there's even regions of Switzerland where you can do that. And these are just the places where Bitcoin is, let's say, official, right? It doesn't even look at all the other places that allow the use of Bitcoin in one form or another. That's it. So basically, El Salvador was, thank you. Thank you very much.